Self-consciousness certainly survives bodily death. Even the New York Academy of Sciences states it that way. Why is it that people become so lucid for that last hour before they die? It's almost like their soul is directly connecting with their central nervous system without the brain in between.
Wow.
If a child has a heart attack, about 65% of the time, that child's going to have a near-death experience where his consciousness is going to leave the physical body. Our cerebral cortex is meant to be serving a transcendent soul.
So are you saying that the human brain is not the thing that has logic? That is a function of the soul?
Yes, that's what I'm saying, yes.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Lila Rose Show. We're getting to sit down again today with Father Robert Spitzer of the Magus Institute. He's here to talk about the mind and the body and its connection. And a little bit of a quick preview here. No, the mind is not the brain. So this is a very, in some circles, controversial topic, but there is a lot of fascinating research and science behind the fact that, yes, we have souls. So we're going to talk about near-death experiences. We're going to talk about people with dementia and Alzheimer's, very young children, unborn children, people with developmental disabilities, and how they actually do have minds that they might not be able to fully communicate, but they're much more aware than we may realize. And you guys, we just launched Supercast, where I have something called the Rose Report, which is this growing community of people who are supporting this show, who are passionate about our mission to bring goodness, truth, beauty into the media marketplace. I would love for your support over there. We're going to be sending out weekly updates, special behind the scenes access. You'll have the opportunity to put in questions for future guests and a lot of more fun stuff. And you can check that out at rosereport.supercast.com. Father Robert Spitzer, thanks so much for joining the show.
It's great to be with you again, Lila.
You are one of my favorite guests ever to talk to, so I'm very excited to have you in studio again today.
Oh, thank you very much. I'm honored.
First of all, for those who haven't gotten the privilege of meeting you yet, give us a little background on Father Robert Spitzer.
Well, I joined the Jesuits after I had completed my undergraduate work, and 1974, I spent 2 years of novitiate there, and then went on to do a master's in philosophy at St. Louis University, went on to do a master's degree in scripture at the Weston School in Cambridge. Oh, I'm sorry, I went to the Gregorian University in Rome for my MDiv, and then my master's in scripture at Weston School in Cambridge. Then went on to do the PhD in philosophy at the Catholic University of America, emphasized space-time studies, philosophy of science while I was there. And then, I've been in various apostolic missions during my time. I taught at Georgetown University for a while, taught at Seattle University, Frank Schranz Chair at Seattle University, went on to become president of Gonzaga University for 11 years, and then came down to California here to start the Magis Center of Reason and Faith.
So you're a philosopher of science with a specialty in physics.
Mm-hmm.
And you've written how many books now, Father?
20.
Phenomenal. And these are not your average 200-page books.
No.
What's your longest book, Father?
Well, it's about 500 pages, but I've just finished the Science, Reason, and Faith Study Bible, and that's a longie, but it's of course combined with the Bible. So it's got an introduction to the Old Testament, introduction to the New Testament, and then if there's some problem, that people or question that people have, and they keep bringing it up. We try to put the right in the margin where the passage is located, an answer to it. So if it's a science-based question, like maybe in Genesis, then I would give an explanation of that. What's the contemporary science? How does the church work with things where there might be a difference between a scientific explanation, a biblical one, or sometimes if it's a morality claim, for example, Moses might be saying, kill every man, woman, child, cat, and dog, right, in the conquered land. And, the student goes, how can that be biblical? What's that to do with Jesus Christ? So you have to explain what's called Ratzinger's distinction between the core of the message versus what he would call the external form of the message, which is culturally bound.
Sounds like a fun project.
Oh, yeah.
and a time-consuming one.
Yeah.
What was your interest in aliens?
Well, aliens is...
How did you get interested in aliens?
Well, because, I deal with the questions of soul, for example, and life after death. So when I deal with, for example, near-death experiences, which show pretty conclusively now, at least according to the New York Academy of Sciences in 2022, right, that it's very likely that your consciousness, your soul body is going to survive your physical body's death, right? So there's really good evidence for that. But on top of that, there's a whole lot of evidence too that basically says that self-consciousness, what we call rational abstract processes and conceptual ideas, those can't be explained by physical processes and structures alone. There's very good reasons for believing that you're going to have something in order to have conceptual ideas, for example. Like Noam Chomsky and Robert Berwick, they may ask the question, well, how come Nim Chimpsky, the highest trained, chimpanzee, right, can learn almost 200 words in American Sign Language? Why can't Nim Chimpsky do the easiest syntactical operation? For example, differentiate between dog bites man and man bites dog. A 1.5-year-old child could laugh at that, the man biting the dog, understand the difference, no problem. You just cannot get a chimp to do the easiest syntactical operations. Well, there's a variety of reasons for it, but the essential one is chimpanzees don't abstract. They don't have relationships among relationships. They don't think in terms of relationship. 95% of the words we use are relationship words, these relationship things. And we're holding them. It's like in our, I'm going to call it a soul.
Is it the soul, though? Because I think the materialist would say, well, that's your brain function. You have a more sophisticated brain than the chimp. And so all of those, that ability to be rational, I mean, I don't know if that's a word you put on that, but your ability to be rational and to see all of those connections and to, think in that abstract way, that's just a more developed brain than the chimp.
Yeah, the problem is, of course, is that in order to get the more developed brain, you have to transcend a level, right? Why can't AI, for example, and I'm an AI fan, I've got my own AI app, right? No problem there. But the point is AI can't do, conceptual ideas. They can't do any abstract idea whatsoever. They don't know what a group really refers to. All your brain can do is what AI can do on the computer. It's basically, if it's just strictly a brain function, you can, of course, through circuitry, you can explain a whole set of perceptions. You can take relationships among perceptions that you can visually simulate and things of that nature. But at the same time, there's no understanding of what that group means, what one means in relation to two, what, cause means. The AI doesn't understand it. It can only be taught how to use it and how to manipulate it in binary language so that you can get, simulate logical operations, but they don't understand logic at all. Not like you and I do.
So are you saying that the human brain is not the thing that has logic, that is a function of the soul?
Yes, that's what I'm saying. Yes.
And so, I mean, again, the materialist, if they were sitting here, or the person who
they would protest vigorously.
Yeah.
But, the challenge, of course, of everybody who thinks like I do in the world would just say, well, show me one single solitary in the vast complex of AI operations. Show me that there is any understanding. Well, first of all, there's not even any self-consciousness in AI. I mean, you can simulate self-consciousness in AI, make it look like it has an ego, make it look like it cares about itself, make it look like it has empathy and really cares for you, and so forth and so on. But it doesn't. It has no sense of itself. It has no sense of you as subject, as a self-conscious entity. It has no natural empathy with you, right? It just simulates what you do. And so again, you see these poor people who think, I love my computer. Your computer doesn't love you back. I'll just tell you that right now. It can simulate loving behaviors, towards you, which it has been programmed to do, or its training modules have trained it to do, but it really doesn't have any love.
EveryLife.com is America's pro-life baby diaper and wipes company. I love EveryLife.com, and I use EveryLife diapers and wipes for my little ones because these are a best-in-class product that are clean. There's no harmful dyes or fragrances or phthalates in this product. It is designed to be healthy for your little one and good for your little one's skin. If you go to EveryLife.com/join today, by joining the Changing Lives Club, you not only get 10% off your monthly diaper and wipes subscription, in addition to that, you'll get a free tote bag, and EveryLife.com will donate a box of diapers and wipes to a mother and baby in need. And I'm excited to share, EveryLife.com is now offering training pants for your little one. These are 12-hour leak-proof training pants, pull-ups for that little one that is maybe potty training. You got to check them out. EveryLife also has just come out with their new shampoo and baby wash and lotion package. The product is amazing. I have already started to use it. That's EveryLife.com/join. Use the code Lila. But to speak of the human brain, so like, for example, here's an article. Yeah. This is an NIH, research paper,
sure.
The Brain Network Reflecting Bodily Self-Consciousness, a Functional Connectivity Study, right? And they're saying several brain regions are important for processing self-location and first-person perspective, two important aspects of bodily self-consciousness. However, the interplay between these regions has not been clarified, so they're not able to fully understand how this works, in the brain. Here's another, website, The Scientific American. It says, case studies suggest that some forms of consciousness may not require an intact cerebrum. Here's something else. Two areas of the brain that are important in retrieving self-knowledge are the medial prefrontal cortex and the medial posterior parietal cortex, the posterior cingulate cortex, the anterior. But anyways, they're trying to explain self-consciousness from a purely materialist perspective of how your brain, a living brain, functions.
All the way they're using self there already presumes you have a self to be located. So in other words, when you see brain stimulation and functions, which you can obviously project even onto a very good brain sketch or diagram, right? You can show where the electrical activity is occurring, when certain events are done, things of that nature. But the idea of having a self, right, some self-awareness, that's caused by the brain, which is, using brain functions, right, to meld your sense of self with the perceptual image that the brain is processing. Brain can process all kinds of perceptual images, but it is not getting a notion of self. By the way, there's very, very good articles that have been written on this. Sir John Eccles has written on this, good Nobel Prize winning physiologist, and also David Chalmers over there at New York University, his big book on at Oxford University Press, very important. Even Thomas Nagel, who's professed really, I'm going to say agnostic/atheist, because he certainly believes in some form of mind in the universe. But all of these people don't think there's any way you can reduce selfhood to the brain, or to any physical process. I'm assuming that the brain is a physical process and structure. That's what it is. And if it's a physical process and structure, no way can you reduce self-consciousness to that.
This is off the topic of aliens, but we're going to connect back to it. I promise.
It's going to be important.
It's going to be important. But I was in a debate, I don't know, a year or two ago, and the person I was debating is Destiny. He's a YouTuber. Anyways, he was saying, well, if you have a brain transplant, are you still you? And I argued, I think you would still be you, but you have to clear the brain.
If your selfhood or your soul stayed with the new brain.
Right.
Yeah. But if it didn't stay with
then it wouldn't be you. How would we know that?
Well, I
guess I wasn't arguing it would be. I said theoretically. Yeah. My argument was theoretically, if you had, because we were kind of discussing what makes you. Right?
Well,
what makes a human a human?
It's really your soul, to be honest with you, self-consciousness, because the self-consciousness cannot be reduced to soul. I think there are really good arguments from an analytical point of view, like Chalmers. As I said, Thomas Nagel has no religious background whatsoever. He certainly does not believe that self-consciousness can be reduced to physical processing structure. So if your view of the brain is basically a mechanistic one, which it sounds like this fellow you were debating seems to think so, then if you got a brain transplant, but your soul didn't remain with your body, it wouldn't be you. If your soul
His argument was that you are your brain. That was his argument. You are your brain.
That's simply not true.
That you're defined, your humanity is defined by how developed your brain is. Because he would argue that the baby at 20 weeks, unborn, has not developed enough of a brain, enough consciousness is the word he uses to describe the function of the brain at that time of development. And so therefore, because consciousness is what makes human beings separate, different from the chimp per se, and you don't have enough of your physical consciousness developed until around 20 weeks preborn, and that's defined your humanity, then therefore, so he's rooting consciousness entirely in the function and development of the brain.
I don't believe that he is correct, and like I said, I'll make recourse to very good studies that have been done by Sir John Eccles and so forth. I don't have to use near-death experiences to show that self-consciousness certainly survives bodily death. There's no question about that. And you can see that, even the New York Academy of Sciences states it that way, right? That it's very likely, that your consciousness is going to survive your bodily death. So it's just not linked to the brain, that's for sure. And you can actually see that. By the way, the cases of terminal lucidity, that's very clear as well.
What is terminal lucidity?
About an hour before death, many patients will suddenly, we're talking right now about patients who have severe brain lesions, severe trauma to the brain, advanced cases of Alzheimer's or dementia, where you've got amyloid plaques, everywhere present in the brain, limiting basically the IQ below probably 50, maybe even to the point of 25. You're basically a vegetable. At that point, I don't want to be disrespectful because what I'm about to say, tells against this. But, because of the brain malfunction, it looks like you're a vegetable. But in point of fact, you are not. In terminal lucidity, 1 hour before death, when your brain doesn't have any capacity whatsoever to be doing any kind of abstract function, let alone self-awareness in any complex way, right? All of a sudden, 1 hour before death, let's suppose I had severe dementia, totally amyloid plaque brain, just incapable of having said anything intelligent for 6 years. I wake up and I go, Lila, I haven't completed my will yet. And I got to call a lawyer and do this and this and this.
You're
and
saying this happens frequently.
Yes. Yeah.
It's documented.
Take a look at Rudolph Tanzi there. And you can Tanzi at Harvard. He says, we don't have any way of explaining this, but about an hour before death, and we know this happens all the time. Basically, people get up and they start saying things and doing things that only a person with well over 100 IQ could say, and then the religious sayings, where people actually will, a person, for example, who's never said an intelligent word beyond an animal noise or just gulping and, in eating, these two researchers in Germany basically were saying, we can't explain it.
I'm sorry, Father, would they become verbal, you're saying?
Oh, yes.
So
they would be singing religious songs. They would be quoting religious poems or sometimes relating stories of, being relating to God.
So this is, how many cases?
Language.
How many cases has this been documented?
Well,
how frequent is it?
A good amount of research done at the University of Virginia Medical School, Department of Perceptual Studies by Bruce Grayson. Just look up terminal lucidity, Bruce Grayson. Take a look at also Michael Naum. Then you have the Loeb and Lorber studies. This would be intelligence in hydrocephalic patients.
Wow.
Just take a look at those studies because here you have, like in these brain scans, right. Hydrocephalus, just for the sake of your listeners, hydrocephalus is when you obviously have spinal fluid that's going up into the cranium, right, and it's pushing the brain. It's squishing the brain higher, but it's also basically destroying the brain and replacing the brain. And it just keeps doing this. And as it rises up into the cranium, you basically have, in some cases, less than a millimeter of brain tissue left.
And just for folks listening, people know this probably, that if you follow the show, children identified as having hydrocephalus in utero the doctors always recommend abort the baby.
Yes.
Don't. This baby is incompatible with life. They have a terminal condition. They say they're going to die soon. You need to abort the baby.
Well, don't abort the baby, and they may die soon. That's fact. But for all intents and purposes, you can see from these cases, these are like hydrocephalic cases. These are adult hydrocephalic cases. And you can see, for example, one person who had less than a millimeter of brain tissue, the entire, 98, 99% of his brain was destroyed. And what little is left is pressed up, just this little thin layer between the cortical surfaces is pushed up against the skull. Well, can a brain that's filled with spinal fluid do any thinking? No. The answer is not with your physical brain. We can see in cases like this with less than 5% of the brain present, almost 5% of the cases, that would be 30 cases out of 600 cases, we see that these people have average IQs. That's the study, the Loeb and Lorber studies. They have normal IQs without a brain. What Loeb and Lorber named their article? Is your physical brain really necessary?
Did you know that over 140,000 U.S. family farms have closed down since 2017? When you go to the grocery store, your meat and poultry products often will say product of the USA, but did you know that 90% of them are actually not from the USA? They're imported in and then they slap that label on product of the USA. Here's how Good Ranchers is solving that problem. Good Ranchers is American meat delivered with meat sourced 100% from the United States. Every cut of beef, chicken, pork, and fish from Good Ranchers is sourced 100% from the USA. Good Ranchers meat is also free from hidden additives. No antibiotics ever. No added hormones and no seed oils. And now GoodRanchers.com has their Spring into Action offer for $40 off your order plus a free add-on for an entire year. You can get free bacon, ground beef, seed oil-free chicken nuggets, or wild-caught salmon as a free add-on with your monthly subscription. Plus, using the code Lila, you'll get $40 off your order. Use the code Lila at GoodRanchers.com.
What Loeb and Lorber named their article? Is your physical brain really necessary?
How was this? This is so crazy. So
It's crazy.
So you're saying, were these adults that had trauma to their brains?
Basically the spinal fluid took the place, destroyed the brain.
They at one point had an actual brain that was functioning. They had an actual brain. And they developed, speech and language and relationships and education. They had education. They had this, disease or this, disease would it be actually that they would have?
Hydrocephalus.
They would get this condition. Mm-hmm. They would lose basically their entire brain, save maybe 5% or less. Or less. Yeah. And they were still able to speak. Think, reason, take IQ tests.
Loeb and Lorber actually found one fellow who had a genius level IQ in verbal and a global IQ over, I think it was 130, with less than 1 millimeter of his brain.
So what does this look like? There's a guy who has a severe brain condition.
His brain is filled with water. His whole cranium is filled with water. And he's walking around like you and me. And he's a math student who can perform mathematics maybe as well or better than me.
So so you're saying that's because of the soul. That's because his soul is what
I have no other. This is exactly what people are saying. These are like scientific researchers who are just saying it can't be the physical brain that's doing the thinking. So if you want to come up with another explanation, I would have to say it's a transphysical thinking operation. And since we see in near-death experiences where consciousness definitely, like in children, if a child has a heart attack, right, and about 65% of the time, that child's going to have a near-death experience where his consciousness or her consciousness is going to leave the physical body in what I would call a soul body that can go through walls and so forth. That child is basically going to have that soul body intact and be thinking and doing all kinds of things. Well, why wouldn't I think that the person, the hydrocephalic patient who's got a genius level IQ and as a math student, why wouldn't I think with 1 millimeter brain that it's that consciousness, that self-consciousness that survives bodily death? Why wouldn't that be the very consciousness that's causing intelligence in hydrocephalic patients? And you know what all the people who have been studying this have said? To speak of euthanasia is simply out of the question. These people still have an intact soul, or if you want to call it a soul body, something is there and it's conscious. It can even, when people are attending you, like in a nursing home, right? And you think, oh, that poor person, Alzheimer's patient doesn't know anything, totally out of it. They can actually, if they wake up in a moment of terminal lucidity 1 hour before death, they might just say, oh, and thank you very much for combing my hair. And thank you very much for doing this. And you're never going to believe this, but I have actually, seen God or be, talking about God or a religious song or something in perfectly articulate ways. And these guys, literally, as Tanzi put it, over at Harvard, where is this from? I would say it's that same soul. I think the evidence for a soul is overwhelming. And maybe we should make that the topic of one of our future Lila Rose podcasts.
We're doing it now, Father. This is so good.
So anyway, so I really do think that there's very, very good evidence for the soul. And I think, as I said, I'm not just making up the things, I don't think you do need your physical brain. Now, in the case of many students, that soul does not make a direct contact with your central nervous system so that you can speak and walk around and so forth in a normal way. So these guys who really, the 5% that are doing that have an average IQ or even a genius level IQ, those people, somehow their soul, something not the physical brain, is making contact with the central nervous system.
So you're saying it's 5%. Let's say there's, all the people with
that's what Loeb and Lorber found.
Loeb and Lorber found. Yeah. But what about, I'm interested in unborn babies and newborn children and very young children, because, we report at Live Action News on some of these cases. As an example, a little boy named Jackson, he was born with severe hydrocephaly. I think he was actually anencephalic. He had a brain stem, but he lacked the rest of his brain. And he was born, he was nonverbal, but his parents, they were told to abort. They did not abort. He lived to be, I think, 4 or 5 years old. And he was they felt that he was interacting with them, even though he was nonverbal. So, but
I think it's perfectly plausible, because I don't think that interaction, honestly, is dependent on the physical brain. As I said, I think there's very good evidence, even that, right now you can't prove that a person in the womb, right, has a soul. You can certainly see near-death experiences of children who are 3 years old, or sometimes even 2.5 years old. Some of the very famous anecdotal stories, like Colton Burpo, right, you can, he's 4 years old, and he clearly has had a near-death experience, and his soul left his body, and he comes back and says, "Well, I met my sister in heaven." The mother says, "No, your sister's right here." "No, not in heaven." "Oh, no, she's in heaven, all right." "Well, how do you know she's in heaven?" "Because when I got to heaven, she came up and hugged me, said that she was my sister." And the mother says, "Well, I don't see how that's possible. She told me that she died 2 months, after she was conceived in mommy's tummy." She didn't use the word conceived. But anyway, she told me she died when she was 2 months old. And she was still in mommy's tummy. And she said that she died then and went to heaven. And she's been growing up in heaven over here. And so she is, whatever it was, 6 years old, 2 or 3 years older than Colton. And the mother goes, well, what was her name? And Colton just said, she has no name because she said, you and Daddy didn't know whether she was a boy or a girl, so you didn't name her. This is exactly the conversation that, of course, the mother and father did not disclose to Colton. But, he didn't even know he had a sister that miscarried. And so essentially, so you can get these anecdotal stories, but, it's very hard to prove. Sir John Eccles, he has a book called Evolution of the Body, Creation of the Self, Evolution of the Brain, Creation of the Self. The self is obviously another word for soul, right? A non-corporeal basis of self-consciousness. So, but it's soul is another word for it. But Eccles has a very good argument that in order, this in terms of brain physiology and the development of the brain in utero, right? Essentially, it's the fact that the brain is oriented towards self-consciousness and conceptual ideas. That is what's making the brain, sort of form in the way that it does. It's not mere genetic instruction. There's something already there.
The soul is instructing the genetic code, is what you're saying.
It's almost as if the soul is, like a telos, right? Like a goal, in a final cause in Thomistic, philosophy is drawing the brain to its completion to be integrated with its abstract, self-conscious, and transcendental self. So, right, there are three things you cannot explain with physical processes and structures in the brain. You can't explain self-consciousness, you can't explain abstract conceptual ideas, and you can't explain transcendental consciousness. Our awareness of perfect truth, love, goodness, beauty, and home, our spiritual awareness of God, which of course includes our moral awareness, or what we call conscience. All those things are not reducible to physical processes and structures.
7 Weeks Coffee is America's pro-life coffee company on a mission to fund the pro-life movement one delicious cup of coffee at a time. And they check every box. This is pesticide-free, mold-free, organically farmed, low-acid coffee that is absolutely delicious. 7 Weeks Coffee donates 10% of every single sale, including the sale you can make today, to pro-life pregnancy centers. And because coffee always tastes better with a free gift, if you go to 7weekscoffee.com today and subscribe using the code Lila at checkout, you'll get a free 2-pack of their new travel bags to take your coffee wherever life takes you. And exclusively for the listeners of this show, you can go to 7weekscoffee.com. You can use the code Lila at checkout to get up to 25% off your first purchase, as well as your free gift.
So, and by the way, I'm talking about, we're not just talking about religious philosophers. We're talking about, non-religious philosophers as well as, as people who are analytical philosophers, people who are transcendental philosophers, phenomenologists, etc. So it's a wide range of people who think it's not just the philosophical evidence, it's also the scientific evidence of terminal lucidity, near-death experiences, intelligence, and hydrocephalic patients.
Wow.
So, the point is do I think that Colton Burpo was making this up? No, I don't. Do I think his parents were making it up? No, but I mean, there's a lot of anecdotal stories beyond Colton Burpo, which would suggest that miscarried children, do have a soul, and they're growing up in heaven. And, it seems like the soul body that leaves our physical body looks like what we looked like when we were between 25 to 30 years old. And so you can see, for example, you take, again, Colton, but there's many other, right? If you go to the University of Virginia Medical School, you get plenty of other examples in their files there. But the main thing is Colton says, I met, a great grandfather or so-and-so. And they go, oh yeah? Well, what did he look like? And they show him a picture, when he was 80 years old and died. And he goes, no, that's not him. That's not him. So and they go, well, what do you look at? Well, he was much younger. So then they get a 30-year-old picture of, great-grandfather so-and-so. That's him, all right. But they put it into a whole bunch of other pictures and said, pick him out.
Wow.
Bing, that guy. That's the guy. And of course.
How old is Colton now? When did this happen, his near-death experience?
That's a while back, so I bet he's 14, 15.
We got to get Colton on the show. That's insane.
Yeah,
that is, I mean, it's beautiful. Yeah. It's beautiful.
Yeah. His parents wrote a book for him called Heaven is for Real.
Yes. Okay. I have seen that book.
And they made it, I think, into a movie or something too. But that's just one example among many. But the main thing, though, is, I think there's something to it. I think what Eccles is saying is true, that our cerebral cortex is meant to be serving a transcendent soul. And you go, well, what's the mediator of that? I mean, how do we avoid mind-body dualism? I think it's quantum mechanics myself. I think quantum fields are what do the mediation.
Wow.
And in my book, Science at the Doorstep to God, I have a whole chapter on this. And I look at what Sir John Eccles says about quantum mediation, as well as David Bohm and other people like him. These are good. David Bohm's a really important physicist.
Father, I have so many questions of what you just said. That was amazing. So where am I going to start here? Okay.
Fire away.
And such fascinating stuff.
Yeah.
It's really, truly mind-blowing. So, okay, the soul. You're talking about this idea of the soul being what is sort of leading the development of the brain. Like the brain is designed, the human body is designed for the human soul.
Yeah.
Which is, fascinating concept. And that there is evidence for the soul and the fact that we have these abilities as humans that cannot be traced back to a material source. It's not like they're coming from the brain. And when we have actual proof of that in terms of these many, many, many examples that have been studied in academic literature and in the field of science that prove that they are not connected. They cannot be connected back to the material because otherwise it's completely inexplicable.
How could a consciousness live on after physical death?
So here's one question.
Sure.
The soul. When do you think, well, in the case of Jackson, let's go back to Jackson, the boy that was born with anencephaly, and he dies at age 4 or 5. He's nonverbal, but he's, interacting with his family. Mm-hmm. A doctor said he was going to die shortly after birth. He outlived him. Mm-hmm. He was recommended to be aborted, right? Which is what we typically do. We abort babies with significant disabilities.
Yeah. Anyways,
why in his case did he not possess the special soul-like abilities to?
He possessed them. He just couldn't manifest them through his physical body because it is the physical brain that mediates what I would call the soul, this a consciousness which can survive bodily death. It's the brain that mediates that consciousness that can survive bodily death.
I have to ask,
the central nervous system.
Are you saying that Jackson and really any person with disabilities where they cannot speak or they can't seem to interact, maybe they're even in some sort of
it's a brain
vegetative state
lesion problem. It is not a soul problem.
But
the soul is there.
But are you saying that they can see potentially or interact, like they would like to interact with the people around them?
I believe
but they have
that,
physical incapability of it.
I believe it because I see that people who have terminal lucidity actually express these things. I mean, they basically, have these moments of lucidity, but they just can't express it. In fact, one case I'm aware of, when I was back at Georgetown, one of the doctors that was working with severe Alzheimer's patients, one of them that was a faculty member from Georgetown University. I believe he was a faculty member, but he was a faculty member somewhere, and he was very important, economist and quantitative economists. Those guys are generally very bright people. And he basically got, progressively worse Alzheimer's and became nonverbal, et cetera. And then finally, of course, you'd think he was a vegetable. Well, there was something still there. So they always wanted him to pin the tail on the donkey or something. He didn't want to play pin the tail on the donkey. You could just sort of see that, people say, oh, he's just obstreperous, he's angry. But no, the fact was he didn't want to play. So one of the researchers, a friend of mine, comes in and he says, we can really see that, you're above all this, and we want you to really help us out on doing some Alzheimer's research. Do you kind of understand that? Well, it takes forever for them to process this through their brain, to nod their head or to make a yes or something. It could take like 30 minutes, to do that. But if you're patient enough, then of course they'll muster it up and they'll get a yes or they'll get a no. Well, at one point, they brought him into it, and he could actually, do you feel like this? Blah, blah, blah. 15 minutes later, yes. No. No, and so forth. So afterwards, this guy brought in from the dean of Georgetown, College of Arts and Sciences, said, hey, we're giving you an award because you've really helped us out to know what's going on in the inner mind of these people who have Alzheimer's. And this guy in 1 second burst out crying. What he couldn't say, he understood exactly what this fellow was saying to him. We got the award here for you, et cetera, et cetera. He could understand it exactly, and it hit him so hard that in the horrible condition he was, he could still be of use, which is all he wanted, and he just instantly burst out crying. I'm telling you, there is so much there. You go into the thing and you try to help these Alzheimer's patients, right? And you say, they can't understand a thing, but they can, and sometimes, if a patient is expressing frustration, it's because they'd rather try to do it themselves. Another really well-known case, the guy's trying to help his wife and put on the makeup for her and brush her hair but the wife didn't like the way the husband was doing it. And basically she was frustrated, because she could see that he was doing a lousy job. And so, the frustration was there. But once the researcher got in there and said, well, you seem frustrated. I'm going to wait here all day for you. I don't care. You just take your time. But are you frustrated, with what's going on? Your husband's kind of doing this makeup not so well. And finally, 15 minutes later, yes. And of course, how would they be able to process that?
Are you saying, Father Spitzer, that because of their condition of Alzheimer's, their ability they know yes immediately?
Yes.
Their soul.
But it's verbal production.
So the soul,
that's the problem.
The soul, which is the actual mind of the person.
Yes.
Not the brain, the mind is the soul.
That is correct.
They can hear it and they can say, because they have physical ears, and they can say yes.
Understand it, yes.
But they can't respond because their brain function connecting to their speech is slowed down.
That is correct. So in other words, it's the brain that's mediating it to the central nervous system and to their speech. Well, the brain's got a problem. And so in the case of terminal lucidity, we're trying to understand it. Why is it that people become so lucid? It's almost like their soul is directly connecting with their central nervous system without the brain in between for that last hour before they die.
Wow.
And so it's so hard to explain. Maybe the soul is trying to leave the brain, but has not yet left the central nervous system through the lower brain. I mean, we just do not know, but something weird is happening. And in the case of these terminal lucidity, the hydrocephalic patients with the normal IQs, it's bizarre. Normally the brain is needed to mediate to the central nervous system. So at least a good chunk of the lower brain is needed. So how in the world is that occurring? But we just don't know everything yet. But we do know that we probably very much do have a soul body. That soul body is self-conscious. It's rational. It feels emotion. It's processing transcendental ideas. Religious ideas are prolific in the state of terminal lucidity, where they come back and talk about God or talk about religion or talk about a religious song or something of that nature. So, there's really a whole lot here that I would say is very good evidence of a transphysical soul beyond, the mere functioning of the brain. And like I said, so many of the researchers just say, when you see this person doing X, Y, or Z, you cannot even entertain euthanasia again. It's just impossible that you should euthanize, or in the case of what you're talking about, abort this person, because they're still a person with a soul, even though they can't get the physical brain to mediate it because of a genetic defect or hydrocephalus or something else.
Is it also, Father, a lack of development, though, in the case of like a child in the womb, their nervous system's not developed at a certain gestational age?
That's correct too.
So what are you saying? Are the implication here is that ensoulment happens?
Ensoulment happens at conception.
At fertilization.
Yeah.
So the single cell embryo has a soul, which is ultimately the mind of that embryo helping it develop, and it develops rapidly, of course.
I believe that that's the case because, the human zygote, the single cell zygote, is basically going to be not just the unity, but the origin of every cell in that person's body throughout the rest of his or her life. So in other words, it's both the unity and the origin of everyone. This is like a super totipotent cell. But the bizarre thing is, it's the totipotent cell which keeps the whole rest of the body together in its interactive configuration. And so there's something there, that a soul could, as it were, connect with. And that is this super totipotent zygotic soul. So, zygotic form. So, the body does have to develop inside the womb, and then, after, birth and things of that nature. And of course, the nervous system continues to develop well after birth. But at the very same time, every single thing which is substantially human is already there at the single-celled embryo state. Everything. That is a substantially whole human being, because the whole genetic code is there, complete genome, plus the totipotent cell, which is the origin of every single cell in that person's body throughout the rest of their lives, as well as the unity of that cell. It is a self-determining cell. It's a multiplying cell. That is self-propelling. And that's what a person like Sir John Eccles would believe, that, that connection between the transphysical soul and the body, which is developing through the genome and the totipotent cell, are already in an inextricable union, so that the soul is influencing the body that's being developed, or drawing it towards its proficiency. So, oddly enough, when you see a little baby sometimes and you go, that guy's got a personality already. Really? Do you think it's just genetics, epigenetics? Or is there really something there?
Wow.
Is there something, as it were,
the soul,
like a soul that already has a kind of series of attributes to it.
So, in a sense, then we could say there's, and I'm curious your thoughts on this. The child, including the child in the womb, including the embryonic single cell child, the first moment of that individual human being's existence, has a soul, and it has, yes, a self-awareness that it cannot express yet.
It cannot express it. That is correct.
But it has a self-awareness.
Yes, and the way that it expresses it is what I call natural empathy. In other words, the minute you have some form of self-consciousness, you go, well, there's no expressed articulation of love. Duh. Of course there's no articulation of love. But is there some kind of what I would call primordial love that is present in that single-celled zygote? And the answer is, I believe so. I think that's what makes abortion so horribly painful, right? Priscilla Coleman's, huge study that says 81% of women who have an abortion do have a much higher rate of well, let's say emotional, psychological challenges throughout their lives, including a 4 times higher incidence of suicides, 2.5 times higher incidence of suicidal contemplation, a 1.4 times increase in depression and anxiety, and a 2 times increase in substance abuse. And you say, well, why? Why would that be? Because when you have an abortion, if I am correct, that, anytime you have a self-consciousness, even though there's no rational, expression of it at the time, when you have self-consciousness, already self-consciousness is empathetically in relationship with other self-consciousnesses. We are not pure autonomous beings. Our form of self-consciousness, yes, circles back on itself and grasps itself, but it's always grasping itself in relation to another. And the most important other is the mom, right? She's the one that, and I think there is a felt empathy for her with her child, and there's a felt empathy of her child with her, but it's not an expressed, remembered, articulated, empathy. But it's there nonetheless. And I call it primordial empathy. And I think if you radically, eradicate it by an abortion, and you break off that empathy, it's almost like the scream of rejection and pain is, almost like present to the mom.
So
in a
painful.
primordial condition, but I think she senses something radical has happened.
I think what you're saying has so many implications. It has implications with regard to abortion. You mentioned euthanasia, and just the general treatment and approach that we may have to people that don't seem fully capable of, communication at the speed with which we communicate, or, abilities or functions at the level of expectations that we have. So
right.
You could be the person, an elderly person that seems to have dementia or Alzheimer's in an old person's home, in a care home, who is basically ignored by their family because they don't know they can't recognize us anyways. They don't care anyways.
Yeah. My supposition always is you better assume that they do, because there is a lot of evidence now from terminal lucidity that they do know what's going on, that they do have a sense of what people are saying. Yes, of course, the brain makes them look like, it looks like they're asleep, or it looks like they may be awake, but they don't have seemingly any eye contact that's significant or would indicate some form of empathy. That doesn't mean there's no empathy. It just means they can't communicate it through their body because the brain is not mediating what's going on in what I would call the soul in any significant way. Look, can they see or hear? I'm convinced that they can, even if their eyes are closed. I'm telling you, when your soul body leaves your physical body, it can see, it can hear, it can think, it can reflect. All of its memories are intact. They're perfectly fine in the soul body, even though in the Alzheimer's patient, they're terrible, right? But not in the soul. There's overlap between memory function in the soul and memory function in the brain. And by the way, there's a lot of people who are interested in this research. It's not just, Samuel Parnia, who's doing, the big AWARE study at University of Southampton, or Dr. Pim van Lommel and so forth. But also you've got Dr. Mario Beauregard, big, scientist there, and brain physiologist at University of Arizona, and another. Read this book, Brain Wars, utterly fascinating by Beauregard, and you can see it. But like I said, with respect to the abortion thing, you have to be so careful of the preciousness of that body. Like I said, it's not just a totipotent cell. That cell is the origin and unity of every single cell for the rest of that person's life. And the genetic code is all of the instructions you need to turn that single-cell zygote into an adult body. Now, you say to yourself, Well, it's still not developed. Okay, let's suppose I create a super program to make the most powerful computer in the world, but I still haven't loaded it onto the central processing unit yet. And so, you walk into my office, you take out all my hard drives, on my, that I have, where the program is stored, and you bash them with a hammer. I come back in, I go, what have you done? And you go, well, you didn't load it up into the CPU yet, so I knew it was just completely worthless. You would just be outraged. Why do we do that with a single-celled human zygote? Everything's there, programs there, the apparatus that will give rise to every single cell and the unity of every cell is there. It's a substantially whole human being, even though it is not fully developed. You're not going to add any more to that human being biologically than you have right there. Yes, you'll add some nutriments, what we call accidents, but those nutriments or its growth is not going to make it more human. It's just going to make it bigger or fatter or, more capable of having a central nervous system or whatever. But no, it won't make it more human. Every bit of its humanity is already there biologically at the single-celled stage. And I would venture to say, if people like Eccles are correct, that really seems to be some form of integration between a soul and a body, even at that stage. And even if we go further and say that the near-death experiences where people meet people who died, inside the womb after 2 months, like Colton Burpo's sister, etc., it seems to indicate that, that's the case. The soul, or what I would call the soul body, because it's not just a disembodied self-consciousness. It is self-consciousness with all of its memories and so forth, but it's also a soul body that pretty much looks like the body when it was between 25 and 30, except, of course, is not limited by physical processes and structures. So it can go through a wall, or it can go through a roof, or it can defy gravity.
I think about the case of Terry Schiavo.
Yeah.
And, she was basically dehydrated and starved to death over a period of, I think it was 10 days. And she had been this healthy young woman. She had had a stroke of some kind, severe brain damage. They claimed she was in a vegetative state, that she couldn't interact. She was killed in 2005 in Florida. And her husband, who moved on and I think took up with another woman, he was still technically her guardian. And so he got to make her medical decisions. And he claimed that she would have wanted to not live in this vegetative state. So we're going to starve you to death ultimately, because you can, I think the Florida law, you couldn't administer a lethal injection. It had to be kind of passive dying. So because she couldn't literally physically feed herself, they were just going to deprive her of food. Yeah. And so they did. And her parents were so deeply heartbroken and enraged. Her brother, Bobby Scheidler, ended up going on and, having his own campaign to try to, Bobby Schindler, having his own campaign to try to advocate for women like his sister. But they said, she's still there. She's still Terry, even though she can't communicate with us. She's sort of
right
non-responsive physically. So are you saying that based on what we know about the soul, all humans have them, Terry has one, Terry knew, Terry was conscious of the fact that her husband wanted to kill her, that her parents were there and loving on her, and that there had been a do not feed order?
Yeah, whether she knew the husband wanted to kill her or not is hard to say if she didn't hear that conversation. But if he had been within earshot...
but her parents were telling her, we want to be able to feed you. I'm so sorry. Yeah. We're prevented from doing this.
Yeah, right.
So she knew that
she would have known that. She sure would have. Yeah, and that's my view.
It's devastating.
Yeah, I think absolutely. You say they can't think, they can think. Just like that hydrocephalic math student, he's thinking and he doesn't have a physical brain. So I think this is going on. I really do think that soul body, eventually when the physical body dies, right, there's a certain level, where you have a few sputterings of neurons in the lower brain for quite some time, but once those die away, pretty much your soul will leave your physical body.
So there's a lot of interesting implications of this. And as an aside, Father, this is such a fascinating conversation. We're going to stick with this if it's okay with you.
Yeah,
and we'll have to have you back on
time.
aliens because we are doing so much progress on this topic. But there's a lot of implications to what you're saying here. It's so fascinating. Here's another implication: organ donation.
Yeah.
So when somebody there's all these cases of people who die. And they die. They have brain death, right? And then they come back to life, in time. Organ donation. What's your take on organ donation and the concern that organ donation might be done prematurely when the soul has not left the body and the body might revive?
Well, I have an organ donor card, so I trust the medical establishment to establish brain death, but I have it very clear that until I'm established to be brain dead, I would prefer not to have my organs lifted from me. But I do think, again, we have to have, very strong definitions of, when brain death occurs, where we can have some empirical proof.
How long should brain death have transpired for it to be, you think, okay to remove organs?
Well, there are some, I think, pretty objective, criteria that are established by Tad, Father Paholczyk at the National Catholic Bioethics Institute. I'm just going to say I'm going to let somebody like Father Tad do it because, make those considerations for me because, to be honest with you, there is so much nuance in this. But when can we be sure that, those sputterings of neurons are past the point of no return? I think we have some conservative criteria that can establish it. And I would certainly, like to specify that that's what I would want done for me.
Same, right?
Yeah.
And so this idea of soul-body separation at death, which is death.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, the sort of philosophical definition of death is soul-body separation.
Well, yes. And of course, you can resuscitate a patient if it's just, for example, a heart matter or a drowning or something of that nature. And so soul-body separation can happen sometimes when there is still a few sputterings of neurons like I said, in the lower brain. So, because the heart attack, is so sudden that the soul body separation almost happens, right away. For all intents and purposes, in the near-death experiences, once resuscitation measures are taken, that soul goes literally, they might be at the brink of heaven, talking to their relatives, being, completely engulfed by a loving white light. They identify as Christ or something. And then bingo, they're right back. So they go through the dark tunnel into the light that's beyond, and then all of a sudden they're pulled back. And that also includes people who have a dark experience. So about 80% of adults more or less have a very good experience. About 20% of adults have a very dark experience. But you see, we only know this from 20% of the adults because only 20% of adults who have undergo clinical death have a near-death experience. Now, the rate is much higher in children. If children undergo clinical death, I think it's like 60% of them have some form of near-death experience.
Why do you think that is?
Because I don't think there's much to be done. I mean, there are certain things that need to be determined in the case of an adult, things that need to be worked out before maybe judgment can occur, or things that need, maybe there's a purgative state that's going to take place or something of that nature. So, adults typically, maybe it's just their memory. They don't remember it as well because maybe they have a higher incidence of dark experiences. Children who have near-death experiences, almost 100% have good ones. Whereas if you get to adulthood, it's an 80-20 split.
Wow.
And so...
and when you say they have a dark experience of near-death, it's like a hellish experience, like they would be going to hell potentially.
Yeah, a lot of them are hellish with demonic beings, but some of them are very lonely real sense of loneliness.
Like an
there.
existential isolation.
Yeah.
And is that because theoretically, again, talking spiritually now in terms of, well, the soul is spiritual, but talking in terms of, our faith, Christianity, that's because perhaps they didn't want to be with God. And so upon death, maybe their final choice of, I don't want God who is love, then their near-death experience is like this radical existential isolation, which is ultimately hellish because they're rejecting love and God.
I agree. I mean, it could be,
Fascinating.
that might be the scenario in question, but it's so hard to say because, we don't have data. We just know one thing. People who have hellish experiences, when they come back, the vast majority reform their lives.
They want to become Christians.
They
Wow.
Yeah, in a hurry. And by the way, Christ is the only religious figure. If you study there's a big, huge archive of near-death experiences with several thousand of them, and that you can actually research them. It's called the near-death experience data bank, and you can actually go there and look at things. But anyway, though, about 20% of the time, people identify Jesus Christ in some bodily form in their near-death experience. They don't, less than 1% of the time, every other religious figure.
Wow.
So it's like Muhammad or Vishnu or whatever, Buddha. So but almost 20% of the time, Jesus is identified. And then Jesus additionally is identified as the loving white light. Sometimes they just call loving white light God, sometimes Jesus. But the point is definitely very much associated with Christianity. And I've got some of those things footnoted again in my book, Science at the Doorstep to God.
Father, what do you think about personality disorders and people who have what you could label a personality disorder, or they have a mental health condition? And this, you could argue, maybe is tied to the body, not to the soul. It's not a defect of the soul. It's because the soul has no defect, right? Except it is wounded by concupiscence, original sin.
Yeah.
Or is a personality disorder, does that live in the soul?
Well, actually, it's very hard to say, honestly. A personality disorder could be a combination, honestly. Sometimes schizophrenia really is a bodily problem. So, for example, if you're delusional, right, or you're seeing the snakes going up the wall, or something of that nature, nobody wants to see snakes going up the wall that are contrary to fact, and so forth. But nevertheless, these things do happen, and people really do believe they're there, and they react, and they can react and do terrible things. Some people are dissociative. Some people have what appears to be a personality disorder, and so forth. And you look at this, and can it be explained biologically? Yes. There's a lot of the time when you can maybe overcome it with, something that will change the brain chemistry or the hormonal chemistry. But sometimes, it's elusive. So you wonder, could maybe a decision to do something evil, which would be more of a soul causation, could that affect or even exacerbate schizophrenia or a personality disorder or dissociative personality or whatever? And the answer, I think so. Yes.
So like a sociopath, as an example,
yes,
or like a malignant narcissist, and there's just they're not. It's not tied to a medical condition. There's nothing wrong with their brain. Their brain scans might look like anybody else's.
Yeah, you have to check all three causes though, because it could be an environmental cause as well as a physical cause. So if the mother does not love the child for the first few months of the child's existence and just leaves them alone and doesn't care and doesn't love, rejects the child's empathy and gives no empathy to the child, you got an odds-on chance of having a sociopath, much more so than a child who did not have that terrible, neglectful experience. So sociopathic behavior can be a result of terrible things that a parent could do.
A lack of nurture at a very young age.
A lack of nurture.
And is that because it's bending the the physical brain, or it's and sort of the psychological connection between kind of our emotional experience and expression with the brain, or is it literally disfiguring the soul of that child? Because that child who deserves the love of the parent is instead enduring abuse.
And it could be both. So it could disfigure the soul, because a child is meant to be nurtured and meant to be loved. We are not meant to be in isolation. And that very much, the receptivity of that love is important to the soul and important to the way that soul makes choices. Now you say, well, wait a minute, what happens, that sociopath dies and he murdered 3 people and did terrible things? What would that amount to? Well, at the end of the day, in God's mind, if the parents cause this bending, as you might put it, or if, this is traceable to a physiological problem or both, then at the end of the day, it's really, he didn't choose to be a sociopath. He sort of goes into it because everything that should happen to him normally in his emotional, psychological development is warped, and is warped into thinking that life is lonely and uncaring and that love doesn't exist. Well, God can cure that in 1.5 seconds. You get to heaven and he can blast you with love that'll reorient your soul circuitry, if I can call it that and mix a metaphor. But I mean, the point is pretty clear. That person could be in heaven, whereas another person could definitely choose almost a sociopathology because of some narcissistic desire, right?
Or maybe this habitual self-indulgence. I mean, I think
you
get in a bad habit of, but even that a lot of times will be rooted in childhood development.
That's correct.
Not to blame our parents for everything bad we do as
No,
adults,
I don't
obviously,
think you
but
should.
we have free will, but
habit can be an impediment to free will.
Yes, it's a good point. Yes.
No,
if you're not willfully choosing the thing because you're so habituated to it.
Correct. Right. I mean, you form such an intransigent habit, right, that essentially it's very hard for you to break out of it and out of the primary associations that you have with people from the time you're an infant.
I have to ask you, Father, about with this idea of soul mind, soul body, connection. And is it fair to be calling the soul the mind?
Yes.
Okay. So
yeah,
this the mind body connection, the soul body connection. So
soul, mind, and self, like self-consciousness, they're all
the
different
same
ways of looking at the same reality.
I know you're familiar with IVG. We had Dr. Aaron Cariani in the podcast recently to talk about this.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm curious how you see the soul when it comes to creating embryos out of potentially skin cells. You create, a sperm cell and an egg cell from skin cells, and then you can create a human embryo from those. Ultimately, it's sourced from someone's skin cell. So your mother, your biological mother, is actually your biological father in this technology, potentially.
Yeah. I mean, again, of course, I think that's totally ethically wrong in every imaginable way. But let's suppose somebody goes through with it. I mean, it's God's choice whether to give a soul to such a being. Now, basically, remember, you have to take that skin cell and you have to reduce it back to, what's called a totipotent, or at least a very pluripotent condition, right? So you just can't take a skin cell and do it. You're going to have to do a kind of a reduction, a very complex reduction, to bring it back to a totipotent cell. Then, of course, if you did something like that and tried to create an embryo, well, if God chose to ensoul it, you could say it's a person.
And how would we know if God is ensouling this embryo created via IVG?
Because honestly, if it didn't have a soul, it would not be self-conscious, transcendental, which includes moral, and it certainly wouldn't be abstractly rational.
So you're saying the way we would know for sure it had a soul, theoretically,
by its behavior.
By its behavior.
later.
Later.
Yeah.
So theoretically, again, just spitballing here, let's say IVG starts becoming used more often, or different forms of sort of, exploitation of the human genome with inputting, animal genomes and like just mix and matching genetic codes and kind of creating this, potentially Frankenstein-like creature. You're saying the way we would know whether or not it was ensouled with a human soul was by how it behaved later.
Yep, that's correct.
But what if it has a disability? Like because you earlier we were talking about
it
the
could
soul,
have a disability.
but the disability is by nature of the exploitation of its genome.
Well, then you could not make that determination because the physical disability would hide whatever soul, or his mental disability or her mental disability would hide the fact that.
So we just wouldn't know.
We wouldn't know.
And then in that case, it would be most ethical to assume that it does have a soul.
I would always do so. Even if you did the most abusive kinds of things, once you've created the Frankenstein, as it were, you're going to have to treat that Frankenstein, if they're manifesting abstract and self-conscious and transcendental, mental activity, you have to treat them as if they were ensouled, and straighten out or find out later from God, But I think you should never take a chance. I don't think you should ever, even if you do this through a horribly abusive process, you should never start killing beings or thinking because I put together the strange components that led to this hybrid or whatever, that now I have the right to kill them like I own them. Because if God hasn't sold that individual, you don't own them.
Or to mistreat them. I mean,
or
there's
mistreat them.
The possibilities of mistreatment here are wild. Developing them and taking their organs.
Exactly.
Using them as some sort of a slave. Horrific options.
Yeah, horribly unethical. And any kind of embryonic transplants are, creating embryo farms to basically produce, stem cells and other kinds of things. It's just unconscionable. I mean, we just don't have the right. These are real beings, real human beings. I think, honestly, all the insights we're getting from the near-death experience research and the terminal lucidity research, I think all these things, plus what's happening now in philosophy of mind, in the whole area of self-consciousness and consciousness itself, even from the analytical philosophers, like a Chalmers or even a Nagel who professes to be somehow, an atheist or something, but just can't, say that physical reality has got to have some component of mind in it from the inception, right? So you look around and things are happening now where, personhood is very much associated with mind, selfhood, self-consciousness, and transcendental awareness. And, if you see a being like, so if you discover an alien, and you see an alien that has transcendental consciousness and has a sense of conscience, like morality, based on principle, has a high degree of mathematical intelligence and logical intelligence, and is self-aware, you got to say, God gave that being a soul. We better catechize and baptize him. I mean, you just have to.
Wow.
Because, to do otherwise would be to act against what I would consider to be reasonable and responsible moral belief that being is ensouled by God. That being is meant for eternity. That being is meant to be respected by us with the very respect that God expects us to be treated with and all humanity in the condition that we are in before our eternal life begins.
Father Spitzer, we're going to have to do a part 2 on aliens.
Oh, yeah.
Because we and there's so much more, I think, even
in this
to
area?
explore on the soul. It's incredibly mind-blowing stuff.
Tons.
So what would your recommendation be for folks listening as a starting place? And perhaps it's one of your books. You've mentioned several different researchers, scientists, but what book would you recommend for someone who wants to explore this more?
There's an Ignatius Press book called The Soul's Upward Yearning that I wrote a while back. I would definitely look at that one. There's another one if you just want maybe a single chapter that puts together the case very proficiently and then talks about mind-soul problems, the problem of freedom, and also transcendental awareness and all of these mathematical intelligence, etc. Take a look at chapters 4, 5, and 6 of Science at the Doorstep to God. So that would be in my writing. I have a ton of footnotes there to all this research. So, some people may want to just look at Sam Parnia's stuff. Samuel Parnia is the University of Southampton Aware Study. You might take a look at Mario Beauregard's Brain Wars, just for a little bit of a sample. Why physiological explanations and physicalist explanations simply can't explain what's going on in near-death experiences. That's a very good thing. Another area that's very good is the whole area of David Chalmers, Sir John Eccles that I was talking about. Even as I said, Thomas Nagel. To look at those areas too. So there's lots of stuff. I have some free stuff. If you go to magiscenter.com, MAGIScenter.com, look at a free article called Science, Medicine, and Near-Death Experiences. That could give you a real boosterino. Look at the chapters, too, on transcendental desires. Chapter 4 of my book, The Soul's Upward Yearning. So there's a lot of research out there in this area. And look at the University of Virginia, a medical school Department of Perceptual Studies stuff, especially Bruce Grayson's and Michael Naum's things that are on terminal lucidity. Take a look, too, at Loeb and Lorber's studies on intelligence in hydrocephalic patients. So there's a lot of places, but it's all footnoted in my book, Science at the Doorstep to God, and also in The Soul's Upward Journey.
You're amazing, Father Spitzer.
No,
you are truly an encyclopedia. It always amazes me when I get to talk to you. It's truly wonderful. Thank you.
Oh, thank
you for exploring this topic with me today. And I know our listeners love this. And we got to do round 2 on UFOs and aliens, because the implications of what we're discussing, I think, there are implications for aliens.
Without a doubt. So, I mean, we do have
promise
to
come back
them.
soon. We'll do that next.
Okay, absolutely.
Thank you so much, Father.
Okay, thank you.
And a huge thank you to EWTN, Eternal Word Television Network, which is the largest religious broadcaster in the world. You can get access to Lila Rose Show episodes 24 hours in advance at EWTN.com/on-demand. And a big thank you to EWTN and their incredible mission to bring souls to Jesus.